I'm Illinois Extension's Todd Gleason. This is FarmDoc Daily Live. The Coronavirus and Ag webinar series today will take up crop supply and logistics for the spring. Scott Irwin is here, ag economist from the University of Illinois, and Jeff Bunting will join us. Mark, I think, Scott, we'll start with you today. Can you take us through your slide set, please?
Thank you, Todd. Appreciate everyone that's tuning in. And I just want to provide a little context for Jeff's remarks. So if I could go to the next slide, please, Jim. Just want to review where we're at in the markets since the coronavirus crisis has taken place. To start with, looking outside of agriculture, this chart shows what's going on in the stock market and also crude oil. And we can see that the stock market a couple of weeks ago bottomed around down about 30% for the year and has since staged a very strong recovery, and in recent days is standing down only 15%, but relative to where it had been, it's up substantially. And in fact, last week was one of the strongest weeks of, in the last 50, 60 years in the stock market. So the stock market is signaling that we're going to see basically economically is forecasting some recovery from the worst of the early fears about where we were headed with the general economy. The crude oil market has also recovered, but for different reasons. At the worst, it was down about 60%, but that was due to both the coronavirus and the price war that erupted between Saudi Arabia and Russia as they were disagreeing about production cuts. And we've seen a recovery of about 10 percentage points or $5 a barrel for crude oil because of the agreement that, intriguingly enough, was brokered by the United States to have some substantial yet temporary cuts in world crude oil. But it's still down massively. So let's turn to ag and see what we get there. This chart now shows the stock market measured by the S&P 500, again as a baseline. And here we're showing the three major grains: corn, soybeans, and wheat. And looking at soybeans, kind of holding in there around down 10, 12%. Some recovery since late March, but basically in a kind of a sideways pattern. Corn has continued to drift down as there have been concerns about feed demand and ethanol exports and and ethanol grind here domestically, so that corn has continued to drift down more than soybeans, currently down about 17% on the year. The one outlier on the grains is wheat, which keeps hanging in there at basically no change due to perceptions of countries beginning to hoard their wheat supplies and a strong short-term demand for wheat products like bread and crackers and so on, basic staples. So that's what's going on in the grain market. Here's what we're seeing in the livestock market. It's turned into a very gruesome picture here recently. Again, you can see the recovery in the stock market. Very interesting. You can see that livestock prices initially tracked the stock market down, which would make sense. Everything was moving down due to the ongoing contraction economically, so that we were seeing livestock prices down around 25% a few weeks ago. And when the stock market started to recover, we have seen cattle and hog prices continue to plummet, particularly true for pork, which is now down basically 50% for the year, and live cattle down about 30%. Both of these reflecting this second leg down in the livestock markets, reflecting backups in the processing of pork and beef due to plant closures or plant slowdowns at the slaughtering plant level. And so we're trying to get a handle on how severe and how long that will last. Okay, next slide. Okay, now just turning to where we're at, thinking about transitioning to the planting of crops this spring. Thought it would be useful to see where we're at in terms of planting conditions. This is an indicator that Todd Hubbs and I really like to look at. It's basically a corn belt wide measure of surplus topsoil moisture. It's basically the percentage of topsoil moisture that's in surplus weighted by acres in the corn belt. And looked at that way, everybody knows it was wet, and we had historically record planting delays in 2019. And we routinely, this measure was between 40 and 50% of the acres throughout most of the prime planting season of April and May last year. And here's our first reading that we had for this chart for 2020, and you can see we're back down around 20%. Dramatically different picture in terms of moisture conditions right now in the U.S. Corn Belt compared to 2019. There are certainly some wet areas, particularly as you get into Michigan, Ohio, parts of Indiana, and in the southern production regions. But the overall picture right now of field conditions in terms of surplus moisture is dramatically improved compared to 2019. And Jim, did we have the next slide that shows the planting progress? Nope, we didn't get that. Okay. Todd, I'll turn it back to you then.
All right. Hey, thank you so much. Of course, that is Scott Irwin, agricultural economist here on the Urbana-Champaign campus of the University of Illinois. You can always find more from him on the FarmDoc Daily website at farmdocdaily.illinois.edu. Right now, we'd like you to take a quick poll, this one asking this question: what crop input production practice are you most concerned with given the COVID-19 pandemic? Select one of the following: energy needs, timely delivery of gas and diesel for your operation, of course; seed shipments, delivery, again; crop nutrients, supply and timely delivery; crop protection, to manage pesticides and that plague your farm. I had not read all the way through that. That's funny. And none. I feel that things look good today. We're going through that poll right now. About 40% of you have voted, and there are roughly 325 of you online with us at this time. So go ahead and continue to vote. Let us know what your answer to this question is, and we'll get some perspective on it in just a moment from Jeff Bunting. He will join us from Growmark. About 50% of you have voted. Anybody else want to take a moment and vote right now on this quick poll question? What crop input production practice are you most concerned with given the COVID-19 pandemic? I think we probably had enough time to go ahead and close that out. There are your answers. The big numbers that you're most worried about, the crop nutrient supply and timely delivery of those, so fertilizer, and crop protection, the things that you'll need to get to your fields in order to control weeds and other pests. So that gives us kind of a good place where we can start. And then I guess I'm a little surprised that that last category, Jeff Bunting, is the largest, which everybody feels pretty good about getting their supplies. You at Growmark probably are thinking that's a good thing, I would suppose at this time.
I am surprised to see the responses, but not surprised. Again, given the work that we've done so far in terms of the hashtag plant 19 and the things that have gone on over the last 2 to 3 weeks. So good kickoff to my segment. And again, good morning, and appreciate the invite and the time to spend the next roughly 15-20 minutes in regards to some of the supply challenges that we anticipate or try and mitigate as we kind of go through the pandemic of the coronavirus and COVID-19. So again, as we think about the kickoff to this year, I would say a lot of my colleagues and peers within Growmark really had no idea that we'd be probably in the situation we are today, given this pandemic, and a lot of us, from the distribution to the retail to the farmer, to the consultants, all wanted to put last year kind of behind us. Again, knowing that it was a challenging year of getting crops planted, falling within the timeline that was allowed to get the crop protection inputs, and the fertilizer was kind of followed by a pretty wet year and a challenging year to get the harvest, the crop harvested, and now we're dealing with this pandemic. So again, I'll go through this morning a little bit about the managing through the pandemic. I'll kind of touch on a little bit of the supply chain challenges that we've experienced, but I will admit too, and again, the response to the poll was very positive in regards to, I think we're doing things to get ahead of this thing, and all the preparation beforehand has caused a lot of comfort in regards to the customers of getting what they need, and they feel good on where things are at. I'll wrap up today's session with more from a standpoint of the COVID-19, the short-term impacts, as well as the long-term thoughts that we have, as we come out of the coronavirus, whenever that could be. But again, it allows us to kind of get some thoughts into how we see it, and appreciate all the perspectives of the audience, as well as our expert panel we have on today's discussion to kind of manage that. Next slide, please. Give you a little bit of background on the system, and I think it kind of sets the stage in regards to how we approach the overall business. And again, as we think about the FS system, it's made up of about 550 retail locations. Again, we're in the top 5 of the CropLife 100 ag retail businesses. We have millions and millions of gallons of storage, and again, that would include crop protection and crop nutrients, multiple warehouses and terminals that we either owned or through third party. A lot of trucks and a fleet of tractors and sprayers to kind of manage, the operations in regards to the delivery or the application of the products that we have across the system. But again, we also think too that probably our major and our dedicated crop specialist team is probably our vital resource that provides the farmers the necessary products and services they need to grow their crop. All this is possible from a standpoint of that strong leadership we have at Growmark, and a very effective Growmark board that has really effective oversight of the entire operations. Again, it's a lot of people working together to make things happen within Growmark, and again, kind of led into this slide here that's up on the screen. We really break it down into really 4 different business units, and I'll spend a lot of my time today on the agronomy portion of it, in regards to the crop nutrients, seed, and crop protection. But you want to make sure that you understand the overall focus on energy, grain, retail, and I really probably lead you more towards the website that we have, growmark.com, to really get more details on the other areas that we have. One area that I want to make sure we can stress today is we have a very effective logistics group within Growmark. And to give you some idea in regards to the scale of that, roughly 125,000 truckloads are shipped annually within the system. And that's very important for energy and grain and agronomy to get things to our members that ultimately get it to the customers. So again, very effective in regards to what that looks like, and I'll add that more color into what that looks like, and we get into more of the COVID-19 and the steps that we took to get us where we are today based on that perspective. But again, we think about agronomy, we got crop nutrients, seed, and crop protection. Again, crop nutrients, again, they're roughly, in terms of the size, roughly 3 million tons, that's sold every year. They focus on roughly almost 40 various distribution facilities that are owned or leased. But again, our concentration of those facilities really are along the Mississippi, the Illinois, and Ohio River. That leverages the domestic and import supply channels that we have for our member company. Again, I'll take the next slide in regards to seed division. So within the seed division, you have a pretty diverse brand strategy, where we focus on proprietary brands being FS and Vision or High Soys. You think about also the option to have NK or Syngenta with the brands from Bayer that's depicted in this overall slide. If I can give you kind of a quantity in regards to where things are at, it's roughly almost 2 million units of soybeans, close to 1 million units of corn, and then we'll sprinkle in some alfalfa, wheat, other field seeds. Kind of makes up in regards to the overall sales and movement of these products across roughly 8 states and also in the province of Ontario. But again, their focus really is more on that brand strategy and taking an approach to kind of that total farm solutions with that seed. Then my next slide that I'll go to and talk about more crop protection. Again, I'm in charge of this division, and I got colleagues that are in charge of the crop nutrients and seed that I believe are listening today. So I'm sure I'll get some feedback in regards to those two topics. But again, within crop protection, we think about the overall focus here. We roughly have 5 terminals or 5 warehouses that we pull from across 19 states. And so again, we're very, very much relying upon distribution, logistics, operations to get products from A to B, and then allow that to get to the overall customers that we have and the focus that we look at. And so again, we look at efficient, reliable distribution of products, and again have a diverse portfolio of products and services that deliver value to the customer. So again, that's kind of the background on where things are at. And again, as I kind of transition into the next series of slide, this really kind of is what we focus in on and within crop protection and part of our, I'd call it more of a pre-COVID discussion I'll get into here this morning. But again, we know that the business has changed quite a bit over the last 10 to 15 years with the plethora of M&As and things that are going on. The wheat science professors, Dr. Hager, including himself, again, done a great job of educating in regards to the weed resistance and shifts due to different production practices and the use of herbicides over the last 10 to 15 years. I would say probably the most interest so far has been around the soybean trait adoption that we've seen. And again, you can kind of see when that trait came out in the year that it was launched. Again, we're coming off a couple of years here where we had a lot of activity in this area. But again, I also kind of summarize this here too, is that what we sell today really has a global impact or global influence in regards to crop protection and the overall business, from India to China to Europe to the U.S. I'll get kind of more details in regards to what's going on there. But again, these are all things that we think about in terms of the pre-COVID-19 challenges that I'll get to here in a second. I mentioned before in regards to the overall global impact of that one there, and again, we're coming off some very rocky couple of years in regards to the volatility, more so from a supply and from a price perspective, but again, also from an inventory position that have somewhat kind of leveled off going into 2020. And again, I think a lot of that goes back to some effective planning that we think about in the overall direction that we're going forth. We also think about from a standpoint of the domestic issues we have, either from legal or from global restrictions, and what that kind of plays into the overall activity within crop protection. I mentioned earlier the China and India influence that we have on market with either inners or regulatory. But again, we're also experiencing, even a year ago, there was a major explosion in China that we're seeing the impact of that today. And it kind of leads into my last slide today in regards to what could be the long-term impacts of COVID-19, knowing that China was shut down for roughly 2 to 3 months earlier this year because of managing the pandemic within that country. But again, we focus more so on our perspective is, how do we get the products positioned that meets the Growmark system needs based on the history of product use and demand that we have within our footprint. Again, taking all that last series of slides and again going into the next slide. So those are the things we did before COVID-19, and again, these are the things we're trying to optimize now with COVID-19 being a part of that one there. So again, I mentioned before, we roughly have 5 terminals within crop protection that we utilize to fulfill orders and get product moved out to all of our FS members. We try and optimize those DC centers the best way that we can. I mentioned before, we roughly pull from 35 different terminals within ammonia, and the activity that we've seen so far this year has been phenomenal. And again, if you probably can follow on Twitter, or maybe get a picture that you happen to notice on Facebook, or maybe other platforms, there's been some long lines of these terminals that really probably are not a direct impact in COVID-19, more from the standpoint of the overall demand that we have this past year, and the focus more so to maybe the forecast, or the planting report of 97 million acres of corn being planted in 2020. So again, a strong demand so far with the terminals and the focus that we have. We're also looking at steps 2 in regards to distribution, and I will say this too, from a standpoint of looking at ways to do things differently. A lot of pre-COVID, or what we're doing now, is a lot would come into a terminal, to a warehouse, and it was staged there, and then we'd move things out. But we're doing more things direct ship from the facilities, to go right to the member companies, to go right to the users of the different seed and technologies, and that would include seed and grain systems. And we've also added carrier capacity to the DCs as well, getting more trucks to deliver products in a timely fashion. And I will say this, but we can't thank those truck drivers enough, and the work that they're doing, the long hours that they're employed right now to get things done. They've been very responsive and very effective in delivering the goods to the essential business that we have within the ag, as well as the grocery industry that we're looking at. We think about the supply chain. If I kind of dig more into what we're doing internally, currently today, as it stands, all of our crop nutrient and DC centers are operating at full capacity. We took some steps here the last couple of weeks to look at how our employees are operating within these groups. And in the past, we usually have 3 shifts during the course of the day. We've gone to 2 12-hour shifts to kind of manage and mitigate the impact of the COVID-19 and the coronavirus. And to date, we've done a great job of keeping the facility safe, keeping them clean, and keeping the employees healthy. So implement different policies related to health and safety of the employees. As you can imagine, a warehouse is very busy. Within my overall perspective, we have almost 100 suppliers that we deal with that will come in contact with the warehouse that we have to manage. So we have a lot of traffic. We have a lot of people involved, and so again, maintaining the self distance and the 6 feet of isolation is important, and keeping guys in their trucks and allowing things to kind of happen without them getting out and having increased exposure to that is pretty important from that perspective. We think about the alternate supply points arrangements, and again, these are things that we started about a month and a half ago in regards to, so what happens if we happen to lose access to a facility or a warehouse? We set up different pickup points, working with the Syngentas and the Bayers and the Cortevas and the BASF and a host of other suppliers that we manage and to bypass the warehouse. So a lot of those are basically set up today in regards to those contingency plans that we think about. Select alternate delivery sites of those products, as well as providing ample FS seed supplies for farmers to get seed in season. And I'll kind of discuss that here in a second as I go more into each of the different categories. Next slide, please. I'll summarize basically each division within crop nutrients, seed and crop protection, in regards to how we see the implications today from a COVID-19. I mentioned before a strong demand of ammonia so far, so we're up to a great start of getting this corn crop planted within 2020. No really major upstream concerns right now based on movement, and again, feel good on where we are with the multiple source points from our terminal networks. If I go into the seed discussion, which is the next slide, roughly today, 99% of that corn has been shipped and positioned for the spring season, with a little bit more delivery yet to go within that from the warehouse or that retail location to the farmer. We feel very good on regards to where the soybean is at today. 97% of that soybean has been shipped and positioned for the spring season. But again, a lot of that is also on demand. There's a lot of bulk systems out there today, and seed tenders. And it's kind of on demand, come location and kind of pick things up. And again, practicing good hygiene, good stewardship, and the 6 feet of isolation is also pretty important. As I mentioned before, a lot of that on the FS companies having in-season needs available. Next slide, please. If we think about crop protection, again, most of our actives that we would need for this system that may be a new order was stateside before the outbreak. And so again, getting those actives into production, manufacturing, tolling into a finished good, I feel pretty good. Also, the benefit of this too is that we had a large carryover inventory from 2019. Again, corn didn't get planted, beans didn't get planted, so we all had planned to plant those acres last year. That didn't happen. Well, that inventory didn't go anywhere. It stayed there. It came back into the warehouse. So again, we still have that inventory to pull from too going into 2020. So I really do feel pretty good, given that the crop protection business will be good in the short term of getting this crop protected with the herbicides, fungicides, insecticides that we need for the current year. I also add too, I mean, you probably heard this too, China is slowly getting back online. It may be a little bit longer in terms of the supply chain and lead time, but again, things are going back into production and starting to kind of manufacture different actives, which again, kind of maybe leading into my next couple of slides. So I mentioned before the impact on China, and again, just here's a stat that's probably a couple years old, but one that I stay pretty close to in regards to the overall relevance of China in production of the pesticides. So again, a large global user, or a large global producer of pesticides that we see across the globe, and again, kind of in that circle within that Shanghai, Beijing area. Kind of the next slide, and kind of wrap things up here in a couple minutes. If we think about the short-term impacts, I'll kind of summarize where we are. We're focused in on the 97 million acres of corn and the 83.5 million acres of soybeans. So again, it's going to take planning and communication across all levels. Again, working remote has caused some challenges, but again, it's also caused a chance to kind of be more effective in regards to our delivery and how we approach it. I would say that in all my conversations, and I mean everyone says this, logistics will be kind of that bottleneck. Can we get what you want when you want it? And again, we've done a great job of kind of staging things in. We're staying in close contact with our FS members and our customers to think about the overall season in different monthly segments. What do you need for the next 30 days? What do you need for the next 30 to 60 days out and the 60 to 90 days out? And think about the overall crop protection season into those different 30-day segments. I feel very confident that we have enough product to get the 2020 season off to a good start. We may have to pivot and go to a plan B or plan C, but we do have options that are available. And again, we still have to be mindful of being careful and being safe. We got truck drivers that's driving long hours. We've got seasons that are happening, things happen fast. Just make sure we can be careful and be safe and kind of managing the overall impact. But I think about kind of the long-term impacts. I mentioned before earlier, China really was shut down for roughly 2 to 3 months. When we think about that overall economy, maybe not quite stopped, but it has significantly slowed down, due to COVID-19. And what does that look like in regards to all the research and the technology advancements that we're looking for to grow this crop and do it effectively and do it efficiently? Will we see any type of a tail going into 21? Looking at product sourcing and manufacturing, all these things that we might start to see that maybe late this year, maybe into the fall. But again, we're kind of keeping an eye on what that looks like and how we kind of manage that. But again, what does it look like after all this? I mean, is it the same? Is it different? And again, it's more kind of more of a discussion and a thought question than more of a comment perspective. But again, we think about the new normal. We think about the opportunities that we may captured from this. We look at the engagement that we'll utilize, and then the reform of what this looks like in regards to long-term impact. So probably more questions than comments. But again, I do know this is we are committed to be a supplier of the products, goods and services, and we'll utilize our FS members as a part of the Growmark system to maintain the relevance in the future and be that supplier in years to come. So Again, I appreciate the time this morning, and I'll turn it back to Todd for any additional questions or follow-up thoughts.
We will have some additional questions. In fact, if you have questions, go ahead and write them into the question box. We'll see them and we'll get them answered in the mean space. We would like to thank the sponsors of this FarmDoc Daily Live webinar. They include the Center for Farmland Research right here on the Urbana-Champaign campus at the University of Illinois, from TIA, along with Compeer Financial, Farm Credit Illinois, the Illinois Corn Growers Association, and FS Growmark. Of course, the University of Illinois College of Agricultural, Consumer, and Environmental Sciences, Department of Agricultural and Consumer Economics, primary sponsor as well. If you've got those questions, go ahead and continue to write them down. A couple of things. Upcoming webinars. Of course, we usually do these at 11 o'clock on Tuesdays and Fridays. However, we do have an extra special one coming up at 1:30 on this Thursday. And because you're already signed up for the webinar series, and this is in the series, you'll get an email on this. This is on the rural economy and the stimulus package that was passed by Congress, that $2 trillion, the CARES Act, and how that funding will be passed along. Nick Polson will be there, along with Bob Ree, who is a tax specialist, and Dale Latz from FBFM. So be sure to tune in for that one. And then on Friday morning, we'll talk about getting this 2020 crop planted, even with good soybean yields following last year. It could be an interesting time. Emerson Nafziger will be with us. He's an extension agronomist here on the Urbana-Champaign campus of the University of Illinois. Jeff, I think we've got some questions. I'd like to ask up front, what actives are you in need of laying in supply for? You said you had most everything available, but the supply chain, as you mentioned, does reach all the way back through China. I'm wondering if there's anything as you look forward that you're hoping you'll get pallets in soon.
You know, again, a lot of our actives now that we think about really falls more on the specialty crop segment. Again, there's a few things there that we're looking at. Chlorthalonil would be one. Clethodim would be another one. They come to mind quickly based on things we're waiting on that may have a link back into China. That honestly, I think in my mind, Todd, it's more from the explosion a year ago than from what's happened in the current pandemic. But again, as I mentioned before, does that have a tail going into 2021? That we'll look at things now to kind of have some positioning, this summer for consumption into next year. So again, I would say this, and I'll kind of summarize it, but my list of actives I need for the season right now in 2020 is pretty small. It's more about the overall impact of how fast can China get up going again and start producing to the point that really feeds into the late summer, fall, and into 21 that I'm looking at right now.
A kind of a two-part question. You mentioned that 49% of the pesticides were originated in China. Do you have a breakdown on insecticides versus herbicide number?
I don't. I could probably go back to that source, Todd, and get that. But again,
well,
that's a good question.
And then a follow-up on that. This one coming from the audience, in order to create a better supply chain security, do you see a need to produce more crop protection actives in the U.S.?
There has been some push towards more domestically sourced products, I would say, in the last 2 to 3 years. So again, and I can see that as I talk to a lot of our key suppliers, both from a major brand and to a lot of our, I'll call some of the generic suppliers. You're starting to see more production being domestic than relied on other countries to supply. So in my mind, that's a great way to kind of manage this and effective too, to keep it somewhat, you have better reliability in getting what you want when you want it.
If somebody wants to know if you've seen an increase in last-minute soybean sales since the May 31 prospective plantings report,
we have. I think if I talk to a lot of our companies down south, I know a couple of large farmers in the area that they're going to probably move more to soybeans, and again, we have seen that probably in pockets. But again, not surprised to hear that given that report on March 31st.
Any questions that you've gone through, Scott, that you want to answer off the top of your head here? Oh, Scott doesn't seem to be with us at the moment. I'll bet he'll come back on in just a moment. So we do have other
Oh,
questions.
I'm here.
Oh, there you are.
Sorry, I forgot that I'd muted myself. I didn't want to say anything over the top of Jeff. Sorry about that. There's a question about concerned about food supply as meatpacking plants shut down due to COVID-19 infections and deaths. What impacts throughout the food chain are you looking at right now? I really do think that our as we listen to Jeff today, right now our major concerns are on basically the milk, meat, and egg side of the food supply equation because of the more concentrated nature of the processing and slaughtering in that livestock segment. To give you an idea, that this is a problem that is building rapidly. Last week, slaughter of hogs week over week was down 35%, and slaughter of cattle was down 16%. So we're clearly seeing a slowdown in our slaughtering capacity in the U.S. right now. That obviously will be directly impact what's available at the grocery level. Some of that is reflecting the slowdown in restaurant demand. Some of it's reflecting more of a supply issue with plants closing down. So it's a combination of what's happening. But I think I like the word that Jeff used. I think that in the livestock sector, we could have a pretty long tail of this as this backs up our just-in-time livestock production systems in terms of we're seeing reports, milk that's being dumped and laying eggs that are being broken and thrown away. And haven't seen any of this kind of reports in, say, pork production, but that backup has to be occurring in the livestock production systems. If you're not slaughtering them, it's got to back up someplace. So I think that these are significant, and we're going to probably have a relatively long tail with those problems.
Did you see the question about asking how far dairy had fallen? I went and looked. I didn't know whether you had
Oh,
a
I did see
number.
that. I have not looked that up. I look
Looked
at.
up. Yeah,
Go
I
ahead.
looked up milk from the high, and it wasn't too long ago. It was far less than I had thought. So it was milk class 3, right?
Mhm.
And it was $18 a hundredweight, and it's now roughly 14. It's less than that, but the number's close. So what, 23, 25%? I thought it would have dropped far more substantially than that. So it appears that this is a supply chain function, probably as DFA has picked up more of the industry and Dean Foods as well, I would think. I don't know. Maybe you, I
I
don't know what.
haven't. I don't have. No, I don't have much direct knowledge of what's going on in the dairy industry. So it's a good question. Um,
How about this one? Did you see the question? If you take, I like this question.
yeah,
If you take coronavirus out of the picture, where do you think corn prices would be?
it's a good question. We're looking at new crop corn futures right now. I believe about 350. Yeah, we have had the big acreage. I would say about 25 cents higher, about
Yeah,
375.
yep. About that 375, 380 period I can see that. Jeff, with 99% of the corn seed shipped, is it safe to assume that Plant 2020 is on track?
Again, I'd say it's on track. You know, I think now we're hoping for a little bit warmer conditions, so to plant and keep things going. We're off to a nice track right now. And again, my comment about the strong run of anhydrous ammonia we've seen the last 2 to 3 weeks, it tells me that producer or that grower is committed to corn. they're going to get it planted. And again, our movement of anhydrous ammonia really resembles, again, it's way ahead of last year, which again we all know reason for that, but it does mirror 2017. That I will coin, and use my quotes here, a normal spring activity. So again, we're on that track now to I think plant some corn acres.
On logistics, you talked about what would having plans in place as it relates to maybe a warehouse going down because of COVID-19. What do
Yeah.
those plan Bs and Cs look like?
Yeah, again, my comment on plans B and C really was more from the standpoint of a product option. Like last year, we had plan A. If you had a more normal planting year in April, but again, say it kept wet, we had to go to plan B because of we planted and the crop came up and we couldn't use plan A because the crop was already up. Or it got rained out and we couldn't do that and you had to go to plan C. So really it's kind of pivoting effectively in regards to what it looks like. And again, every location, every area is somewhat different, and again, a lot of the insight and more specific recommendation that really should come from the local FS cost specialist to kind of give you what that looks like, and you have to go back to a plan B or plan C based on your operation.
Clearly, I was doing something else when you made that mention. I was reading through probably the questions at that time. A couple of other questions, and I don't know. I think maybe both of you might take a stab at this. Do we expect any permanent agricultural or regulatory changes due to the pandemic?
I'll start this response, and again, I think it's too early to tell if we see any type of regulatory changes due to the pandemic. I would tell you this. We're trying to source, and again, I think there's been some discussion around the Illinois corn growers, providing some hand sanitizer for a lot of facilities across Illinois. PPE comes up all the time in my conversations, in terms of how we kind of manage and handle pesticides and the application procedures, and that includes the safe handling of anhydrous ammonia and other end sources. I really don't see any major changes from a standpoint of the pandemic on regulatory. But again, it's a pretty fluid situation, and as we get into the season, we might see some things changes, but I don't see anything in the short term, Todd.
How about you, Scott?
I don't have any particular knowledge of these crop supply logistical regulations. Where I see the biggest changes coming are more at the strategic and political level. I think there's going to be probably tremendous pressure to diversify supply chains for critical items, particularly medicine and foods. So I think that there'll be a lot of rethinking about how much of our critical crop protection, and any other areas related to food production that are located in China. I also think that there's going to probably be pressure, at least, for a rethinking of our relationships with China, which ag has a very large stake in. And so those conversations, you can already see them being discussed. I don't know what the traction they will really get, but that's where I see the real question is, repercussions from the pandemic, which we know the source was in China, and will there be long-lasting kind of political repercussions from that? That, to me, is the real question we're going to face moving forward in this area.
Scott, you talked about crude oil and the price and the changes that have taken place this week, the deal that was cut. There was a question about corn, of course, ethanol usage, and your expectations for the rest of the driving season and what that might mean.
There's a lot of discussion about just how much corn ethanol use are we going to lose because of the restrictions and sheltering in place? Probably the the biggest amount that I can see right now as a reasonable estimate is what I call a gross loss of maybe 500 to 550 million bushels of corn, roughly a 10% loss in the ethanol grind. But it's always important to remember that roughly a third of that loss in ethanol corn grind will come back in the form of corn feeding use or in terms of additional soybean meal demand. So it sure looks to me like the U.S. is going to there's going to be extreme pressure to begin reopening the economy in May. I think that is going to happen. I think that's exactly what the stock market is predicting. But overall, we're probably looking at that something like an 8 to 10% loss in the 1920 marketing year level of corn ethanol use. So that's what I see. But I also want to make this comment. I certainly will sound like the classic two-armed economist, but I think that there's going to be tremendous pent-up demand for travel and socialization the second that it is allowed. And I think there's some potential for us to be surprised how quickly, say, by July and August, for miles driven to recover, which might mute what I'm talking about, that 10% decline scenario, a bit.
A follow-up question to regulatory and logistics as it relates to agriculture. Part of this coming from the audience as well. On the pesticide side, Bayer in Germany, Corteva in the United States, Syngenta, based out of Sweden but owned out of China, and then Smithfield on the meat supply side, owned by a Chinese company. Do we see an impact on Syngenta and Smithfield at all on the regulatory side, or even on the size of these companies that are supplying the bulk of the food across the planet?
Well, I think one reaction is, those companies are there for a reason. They provide services and are an important part of the supply chains. So you just can't say, okay, tomorrow we're going to break them up. We're going to move everything back to the United States. I think we'll realize there are tremendous costs to that. So I think the real question will be kind of incrementally what practical steps can be made. And I think people are just trying to figure that out right now.
Any other questions that we ought to take up? We're about 50 minutes into our webinar at this point.
Right. I see we have a question. One person asked about, said many farmers in Iowa with corn saw a 60% drop in prices at their local co-ops. And I should have said in the graphs that I drew, those are based on futures prices. So that's an excellent point, that we've seen basis levels really expand, weaken. And so the localized drop in grain and even livestock prices can be much larger. So that's a very good observation that the person made.
With that, I think we'll close our time out here today. Thank you so much, Jeff Bunting and Scott Irwin, for joining us here on this FarmDoc Daily Live webinar, Coronavirus and Ag. We appreciate it.